Most people remember Princess Margaret as the golden girl of the British monarchy, the Queen's beautiful younger sister, the most photographed woman in the country, wrapped in couture and diamonds, with the whole world at her feet. But behind the glamour stood a woman who had been handed almost everything a life can offer and would spend the next 40 years giving it all away. She had the palaces, the jewels, the fame and the freedom, and none of it was ever enough. She lost the man she loved to save her place in the family. She married the wrong man to fill the hole he left, and she ended her days scalded, frail, and half forgotten in a body she had spent a lifetime punishing. This is the story of the woman who had it all and threw it away. If you love the stories the history books tidy away, the ones told from inside the palace and not the polished version handed out at the gate, subscribe now and stay with me. What follows is not the fairy tale you were sold. Chapter 1. The spare nobody planned for. She was born in a thunderstorm at a haunted Scottish castle, the second daughter of a man who was never meant to be king. The date was the 21st of August, 1930. The place was Glamis Castle, in Angus, in the cold east of Scotland, the ancient seat of her mother's family, the Bowes-Lyon Earls of Strathmore. A storm was said to have broken over the glens that night. The child arrived late in the evening, delivered by surgery, and she was the first member of the British royal family to be born on Scottish soil in more than 300 years. They christened her Margaret Rose. Inside the family, she was simply Margot. Her father was Prince Albert, the Duke of York, the second son of the reigning king, George V. Her mother was Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, a Scottish earl's daughter who had married into the royal house from the outside. Margaret had one sibling, an elder sister born 4 years before her, in 1926, a serious and careful girl named Elizabeth, who would one day become queen. From the very beginning there were two sisters, and from the very beginning they were not the same. Consider where Margaret stood at her birth. Her grandfather was king. Her uncle, the glamorous Prince of Wales, was the heir. Her own father was only the second son, the reserve, the one history was not expected to need. That made Margaret, at the moment she drew breath, no more than fourth in the line of succession. She was a long way from the throne, and everyone in the family assumed she would stay there. The Yorks lived the life of a senior royal family at one remove from the crown. They had a townhouse at number 145 Piccadilly in the heart of London. They had Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park. They had 2 little girls, a nursery, a governess, and every reason to expect an ordered, private, comfortable life. That life lasted 6 years. In January of 1936, the old king, George V, died. Margaret's uncle came to the throne as King Edward VIII. He was handsome, modern, wildly popular, and he was in love with a woman the establishment could not accept, a twice-divorced American named Wallis Simpson. For most of that year, the crisis was kept from the public. Behind the palace doors, it tore the family apart. And in December of 1936, after less than 11 months as king, Edward did the thing no British sovereign had ever chosen to do. He gave up the throne. He abdicated, so that he could marry the woman he loved. The crown fell, without warning, onto the shoulders of Margaret's father. The shy, stammering second son, who had never wanted it and never trained for it, became King George VI. In a single afternoon, the quiet York household became the centre of the monarchy. Margaret's sister Elizabeth, 10 years old, became the heir to the throne. And Margaret, 6 years old, was lifted from fourth in line to second, the daughter of a king, the spare to a future queen. She is said to have asked her sister a sharp question when the news came. If Elizabeth was going to be queen one day, then what did that make Margaret? It was the question of her whole life, asked at the age of 6, and it never received a satisfying answer. Elizabeth had a destiny now. Elizabeth had a purpose written into her from that December afternoon. Margaret had only proximity to it. She was close enough to the throne to be trapped by all its rules, and never close enough to be given anything real to do. The family left Piccadilly and moved into Buckingham Palace, 600 rooms of cold state grandeur that the little girls found more like a museum than a home. When the Second World War came, the two princesses were sent to Windsor Castle, where they spent the war years behind blackout curtains and stone walls, putting on small pantomimes to keep up morale. Margaret was the funny one, the mimic, the performer, the child who could make the staff laugh and make her stern father soften. Even then, the roles were set. Elizabeth was the dutiful one who would inherit the earth. Margaret was the charming one who would inherit the spotlight, and very little else. There is a particular cruelty in being born to a role that is then taken away. Margaret had come into the world as a minor royal, free to grow up at a slight distance from the machine. The abdication dragged her into its very heart and told her, in effect, that she now belonged to the institution completely, while giving her no throne, no crown, and no clear task to justify the sacrifice. She would spend the rest of her life inside that contradiction, adored and idle, central and useless, a princess with everything except a purpose. Nobody could see the shape of it yet. She was only a bright, quick, mischievous girl in a castle full of secrets, with a king for a father and a future queen for a sister. But the trap had already closed, and in a few short years, that same bright girl would grow into something the newspapers had never seen before and could not stop watching. Chapter 2. The Golden Girl with Nothing to Do. By her 21st birthday, she was the most photographed woman in Britain, and she had almost nothing she was allowed to do. When the war ended, Britain was grey. The cities were scarred, the rationing dragged on for years. The whole exhausted country was hungry for colour, for glamour, for something bright to look at. And there, ready-made, was Princess Margaret. She came of age just as the nation went looking for a fairy tale, and she fit the part as though she had been designed for it. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, with a tiny waist, porcelain skin, and vivid blue eyes that the cameras loved. She wore the great couturier Norman Hartnell, and later the new young designers, with a confidence her elder sister never had. Where Elizabeth was careful and reserved, Margaret was quick, funny, flirtatious, and openly alive. She could sing. She could play the piano well enough to silence a room. She had wit sharp enough to wound and charm, warm enough to heal the wound a moment later. She was, by the common verdict of the age, the most glamorous woman in the country, and for a few short years she seemed to embody everything a drab, post-war Britain wanted to believe was still possible. She became the leader of a fast, bright social circle the newspapers christened the Margaret Set. They were young aristocrats, actors, wits, and heirs, and they moved through the smart addresses of post-war London by night. The 400 Club, the Café de Paris, the Mirabelle restaurant. Margaret smoked in public, often through a long, elegant holder that became part of her image. She danced until the early hours. She stayed out later than any royal woman had dared to before her, and the gossip columns tracked every step of it. When she toured the Caribbean in the middle of the 1950s, she caused such a sensation that local musicians composed calypsos in her honor and sang them in the streets. There was real talent under the glamour, and that made the waste of it sharper. She had a fine natural voice and played the piano with a skill that professionals admired. She could carry a song from a West End musical, mimic a stiff courtier until the room wept with laughter, and hold a table of clever people through a long dinner by the sheer force of her company. In another life, born to any family but her own, she might have made a career on the stage. Instead, her gifts had no outlet but the drawing room and the nightclub, performed for friends, and never for a purpose. The comparison with her sister was there from the start, and it never left her. In 1947, Elizabeth had married Prince Philip and begun the slow, serious apprenticeship of a future queen. She had a husband, a role, a direction, a reason to rise each morning. Margaret had none of these. She had the applause and the wardrobe and the endless free hours of a woman with nothing she was required to do. The men in grey suits who ran the palace watched her nightclub habits with open unease, and briefed against her when they could, seeing in her freedom a threat to the dignity they were paid to protect. Here is the scale of the fame. She was one of the two most recognizable young women on earth, alongside her own sister. Her face sold newspapers across 4 continents. She received thousands of letters a week from strangers. She had a household of her own, with ladies in waiting, a private secretary, dressers and staff, all arranged around a young woman in her 20s. She held one of the most envied positions in the world, and she was permitted to do almost none of the things an ordinary person does to build a life, because that was the hidden truth underneath the glamour. Margaret had the spotlight and no script. Her sister trained for the throne. Her sister married in 1947 at the age of 21 to a naval prince and began the long apprenticeship of a future queen. Margaret, meanwhile, was expected to be decorative. She opened buildings. She lent her name to charities. She smiled for the cameras and wore the clothes and hosted the parties. But she had no real work, no clear duty, no purpose that belonged to her and her alone. And a woman as clever and as restless as Margaret felt the emptiness of it keenly. The palace watched her with a wary eye. She was too modern, too quick, too fond of the nightclub and the cigarette and the late hour. Courtiers who had built their lives on discretion found her a problem waiting to happen. She had inherited the family's rank, but not its caution. And in a monarchy that survived on appearances, a princess who lived out loud was a risk that the men in grey suits could never quite control. So the golden girl glittered in a cage she could not see. To the public, she was a dream made real, the beautiful princess who had it all. To herself, she was a young woman with a first-class mind and a full heart, and nowhere to put either. She wanted what her sister had, not the crown itself, but the meaning that came with it. And she wanted, above everything, to love and to be loved on her own terms. The applause was loud, the days were empty, and into that emptiness, quietly and without warning, walked a man in a Royal Air Force uniform, 16 years older than she was, who would give her, for the first time in her life, something real to want. Chapter 3. She fell for the wrong man. The man who taught her what love felt like was 16 years older, employed by her father, and married to somebody else. His name was Peter Townsend. He was a Royal Air Force officer of the finest kind, a Battle of Britain fighter pilot who had flown against the German raids in the summer of 1940, shot down enemy aircraft, and worn his courage lightly. He was tall, quiet, handsome, and gentle, with the kind of modest heroism that belonged to that generation of airmen. In 1944, while the war still raged, he had joined the royal household as an equerry to King George VI, one of the trusted officers who attend the sovereign day to day. He was, by every account, a genuinely good man. He was also, at the time he entered Margaret's life, a married man with 2 young sons. Margaret was 14 when he first arrived at the palace. He was 30. For years he was simply a fixture of the household, a familiar figure at Windsor and Buckingham Palace and on the royal tours. But somewhere in those years, as Margaret grew from a girl into the most glamorous young woman in Britain, the thing between them changed. On the long royal tour of South Africa in 1947, with Margaret 16 and the days spent riding out across the veld, an attachment began to form that neither of them, at first, would name. What drew her to him is not hard to understand. Townsend was everything the young men of the Margaret set were not. He was steady where they were shallow, serious where they were silly, and he had looked death in the face and come back gentle rather than hard. He treated her not as a prize or a headline, but as a person. For a young woman surrounded by flatterers and photographers, that was intoxicating, and he had suffered too. His own marriage was failing under the strain of the very royal service that had brought him close to her. And in Margaret, he found a warmth and a spark that his own home had lost. There was something else drawing them together, unspoken and powerful. Townsend had stood close to Margaret's father through the hardest years of the reign, the war years, and the king had come to lean on him and love him almost as a son. When George VI died in 1952, Townsend was one of the few people alive who had shared that private world with Margaret, who had known her father as she had known him. Grief is a powerful adhesive. In the raw months after the king's death, the young princess and the quiet airman were bound together by a loss that almost no one else could fully understand. And what had been affection deepened in that shared mourning into something neither of them could any longer pretend away. He was, in every sense, the opposite of the life she was supposed to want. He had no title, no fortune, no grand estate. He had only his war record, his gentleness and his devotion, and to Margaret, surrounded since birth by rank and wealth and emptiness, those were the rarest things in the world. She had been offered a lifetime of glittering suitors with the right names and the right acres. She wanted the airman who owned almost nothing, and loved her as a woman rather than a prize. His marriage broke down over the following years. In 1952, the man who had entered her life as a married equerry was divorced, the innocent party in the eyes of the court, but divorced all the same. And that single fact, in the Britain of the early 1950s, was a wall higher than any castle. Because Margaret was not free to love where she chose. She was the daughter of a king, the sister of a queen, and the family she belonged to sat at the very head of the Church of England. A church that held, without exception, that marriage was for life and that a divorced person could not remarry while a former husband or wife still lived. For a while, though, none of that mattered, because none of it was yet real. In February of 1952, Margaret's father, the king, died in his sleep at Sandringham, worn out at only 56 by illness and the burden of a crown he had never wanted. His elder daughter became Queen Elizabeth II, and in her grief, Margaret turned more and more to the one man who seemed to understand her, the quiet airman who had served her father, and now, quietly, loved her. In the shattering months after the king's death, the attachment between the princess and Group Captain Peter Townsend deepened into something that could no longer be denied. He proposed. She accepted. In her own heart, the matter was settled. She was in love, properly in love, for the first and truest time in her life. She was the most admired young woman in the world, and she had found a good and gentle man who loved her back. For one brief season, it must have seemed to Margaret that she could have the fairy tale after all, that the golden girl could have the golden ending, that the spotlight and the love could belong to the same life. She had no idea what was coming. She did not yet understand that the same family, the same church, and the same establishment that had made her would rather break her heart than bend a single rule to let her keep it. The love was real. The trap was already set. And it would spring in front of the whole watching world at the most public moment of her sister's reign. Chapter 4. A nation discovers her secret. A single gesture at her sister's coronation, caught by 100 cameras, told the world what the palace had been hiding. The date was the 2nd of June, 1953. The place was Westminster Abbey, on the day Queen Elizabeth II was crowned. It was the grandest state occasion in living memory, watched by millions on the new medium of television. A golden morning of trumpets and ermine meant to launch a new Elizabethan age. And in the middle of all that ceremony, as the royal party gathered, Princess Margaret did a small, unthinking, intimate thing. She reached out and brushed a piece of fluff from the uniform of Group Captain Peter Townsend. It was nothing. It was everything. It was the casual, tender gesture of a woman who knows a man's clothes as well as her own. The photographers saw it, the reporters saw it. And within days, the story that the palace had worked so hard to keep quiet was running in newspapers around the world. The Queen's sister was in love with a divorced commoner 16 years her senior. The secret was out. And it was out at the very moment the monarchy most wanted the world looking at its spotless new queen. The reaction was immediate, and it was cold. The British press, still deferential in that era, was cautious at first. But the foreign papers had no such restraint, and soon the whole affair was public property. To the ordinary reader, it seemed simple and romantic. A beautiful princess loved a brave war hero. Why on earth should she not marry him? But inside the palace and inside the government, the matter was seen as a crisis that touched the very foundations of the crown, and the men who ran those institutions moved quickly to contain it. Their first act was to separate the lovers. Townsend was serving as an equerry, close to the heart of the royal household, close to Margaret every day. That could not continue. Within weeks of the coronation, he was removed from his post and sent abroad, appointed as air attaché at the British Embassy in Brussels. The posting was dressed up as a normal career move. Everyone understood what it really was. It was exile. It put the English Channel between the princess and the man she meant to marry. And it did so at the exact moment their engagement might have been announced. The decision to send him away had come from the very top of the royal household. The Queen's private secretary, Sir Alan Lascelles, a courtier of the old school who had served Margaret's grandfather and her father before her, regarded the match as a disaster for the monarchy and moved to end it. It was Lascelles, by most accounts, who pressed for Townsend to be posted abroad, and who framed the whole delay as a matter of law and duty. The Prime Minister of the day was Winston Churchill, by then an old man in his second time in office. He was said to be romantic about the affair at first, inclined to let the young couple have their way, until his own advisers and his wife reminded him what was truly at stake. In the end, the government spoke with one voice. The princess must wait, and the airman must go. Behind all of it lay a fear that no one in the palace would say aloud: the abdication. Less than 20 years before, Margaret's uncle had thrown away a crown for the love of a divorced woman, and the wound of it was still raw in the family and the country. The establishment was terrified of a second scandal in the same vein, a second royal willing to put love before duty, a second crack in the fragile idea that the family stood above ordinary human weakness. Margaret was not the heir, but she was the sister of the Queen, and the men who guarded the throne had decided that they would not live through another 1936. Whatever it cost the young woman at the centre of it, the line would hold. There was a legal clock ticking behind all of this, and it explains the cruelty of the timing. Under an old law called the Royal Marriages Act, passed in 1772, No descendant of King George II could marry without the consent of the reigning sovereign. Margaret was 22. Until she reached the age of 25, she could not marry without the Queen's formal permission, and the Queen, bound by her advisors and her role as head of the church, could not simply give it. The advice from the government was to wait. Wait until she was 25. Then perhaps the rules might bend. So they waited, and they were kept apart. For 2 long years, the lovers were allowed only letters and the occasional carefully managed meeting. Townsend sat in Brussels. Margaret carried on with the public round of a princess, opening things, smiling for cameras, dancing at the parties, while the whole country followed the drama of her heart as though it were a serial in a magazine. She became, in those years, the most watched woman in the world. Not for her glamour now, but for her longing. Every appearance was scanned for a sign. Every rumor of a meeting made headlines. Think about what that did to a young woman still grieving her father, still finding her feet, still only in her early 20s. She had done nothing wrong. She had fallen in love with a good man. And for that she was being managed, delayed, separated, and studied by the most powerful institutions in the land. Her private heart turned into a matter of state. The golden girl who had seemed to have everything was learning, in the most public way imaginable, exactly how little of her own life she was actually allowed to control. And still, she believed it would come right. She held to the promise of that far-off birthday, the 25th year that was supposed to set her free. She counted the months. She kept his letters. She told herself that duty and love could be reconciled if only she was patient enough. What she did not yet understand was that the birthday would bring no freedom at all. When the day finally came, the establishment would not open the door. It would simply show her in full the price of walking through it, and the price would be everything she had. Chapter 5. The Crown Names Its Price. To keep the man she loved, she would have to give up her title, her income, her place in the family, and her country. The 21st of August, 1955, arrived at last. Margaret turned 25. Under the terms everyone had been waiting for, she was now, in theory, free of the need for the Queen's consent. She could marry Peter Townsend. The 2 years of waiting were over. The airmen came back from Brussels that autumn, and for a few weeks the whole country held its breath, certain that the fairy tale was finally about to reach its happy ending. It was a trap dressed as a door, because the law had a second half that the romantic public had never been told about. Yes, at 25, Margaret no longer needed the Queen's personal consent. But the same Royal Marriages Act provided that she must instead give notice to Parliament, and that the Parliaments of Britain and the Commonwealth could object. And the government of the day made it brutally clear what would follow if she went ahead. To marry a divorced man, in defiance of the church her sister headed, Margaret would have to renounce her rights of succession to the throne. She would have to give up her royal title and her official position. She would very likely have to leave the country and live abroad, and she would lose her income. Here the cold arithmetic of the trap comes into focus. As a princess of the blood, Margaret received an allowance from the public purse, a civil list annuity of £6,000 a year, a substantial sum in 1955, several times the earnings of a comfortable professional family. Parliament had also set aside a further £15,000 a year that was to become payable to her only upon what the settlement primly called a suitable marriage. A marriage to a divorced airman would not be suitable. Marry Townsend, and the 15,000 vanished. The 6,000 was thrown into doubt, and Margaret would step out of the palace and into ordinary life with a modest officer's pension and whatever the couple could earn. She had never in her life bought her own groceries or paid her own rent. Now she was being asked to give up the throne, the title, the country, and the fortune, all at once, for love. To understand how total the demand was, consider what ordinary life would actually have meant for her. She would have ceased to be a royal highness. She would have lost her place in the order of succession, then third in line, and been struck from the working family. She would most likely have lived abroad for a time, out of sight, so that her presence could not embarrass the crown. She would have had no palace, no household of servants, no income from the state, only the modest pension of a retired group captain and whatever a private life could earn. For a woman who had never in her life handled money, cooked a meal, or kept a house, who had been dressed and driven and attended since the day she was born, this was not romance. It was exile into a world she had no idea how to survive. The government made sure she understood every part of it. In the autumn of 1955, the cabinet drew up the terms in cold detail, and the newspapers, sensing the drama, took sides. Some urged her to follow her heart. Others warned that the monarchy could not withstand another royal marrying a divorced person so soon after the abdication. The church pressed from one side, the politicians from another, the courtiers from a third, and all of them, in their different voices, said the same thing. Choose. And whichever way she chose, she would lose. There was no arrangement, no compromise, no clever path through the law that let her keep both the man and the life. The machine had been built precisely so that a woman in her position could not win. The church stood immovable behind the government. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Fisher, held firmly to the doctrine that marriage was indissoluble and that a divorced person could not remarry in church while the first spouse lived. Margaret was not merely a Christian woman. She was the sister of the supreme governor of that very church. For her to marry a divorced man would be to place the royal family in open conflict with its own faith, and that the establishment would not allow. Even the politicians who might have helped her could not. The Prime Minister of the day was Anthony Eden. And here lay a bitter irony, because Eden was himself a divorced and remarried man. He understood Margaret's position better than almost anyone, yet even he, sitting at the head of the government, could not or would not clear the way. The cabinet was unwilling to sanction the marriage on any terms except renunciation. The doors that might have opened stayed shut, one after another, and the walls closed in. So this was the choice laid before a young woman of 25 in the autumn of 1955. On one side stood Peter Townsend, the good and gentle man she loved, and a life of exile, ordinary money and lost position. On the other side stood the family, the title, the palaces, the income and the country, and a future without him. There was no version in which she kept both. The institution that had raised her, that had dragged her into its heart at the age of 6, now demanded that she prove her loyalty by sacrificing the one thing she wanted for herself. It offered her everything, on the single condition that she surrender the only thing she truly loved. For weeks that autumn she agonized. She met Townsend again. They talked it through, over and over, two people trying to find a way out of a maze that had no exit. The press camped outside her door. The public prayed and speculated. Courtiers pressed her, gently and not so gently, toward the answer they needed. And slowly, painfully, the golden girl who had seemed to have the world at her feet came to understand the truth of her position. She was not free. She had never been free. And the price the crown had named for her freedom was a price she found, in the end, she could not pay. Chapter 6. She chose the throne over love. On the last day of October 1955, She picked up a pen and ended the great love of her life in a single paragraph. The statement was issued on the 31st of October 1955. It was short and it was devastating, and Margaret is said to have written it with Townsend himself at her side, the two of them composing together the words that would part them forever. She announced that she had decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. She acknowledged that she might have been able to contract a civil marriage had she been willing to renounce her rights of succession. But, she wrote, mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of her duty to the Commonwealth, she had resolved to put these considerations before all others. Mindful of the Church, conscious of her duty. She was 25 years old, and in those careful, dignified sentences, she surrendered the man she loved to the institution that had made her. She chose the throne, the title, the family, and the country over Peter Townsend. She chose duty over the heart. And whatever the public words said about faith and commonwealth, those who knew her understood the private truth. Margaret had been broken to the shape the monarchy required, and she had let it happen, and she would carry the wound of it for the rest of her days. Townsend went back to Brussels, and then further away still, into a new life. He would eventually remarry, some years later, a young Belgian woman who, by an eerie coincidence, resembled the princess he had lost. Margaret stayed behind the palace walls with everything she had bought at the cost of her happiness. The nation, on the whole, admired her decision. The newspapers praised her sacrifice, her sense of duty, her devotion to church and crown. She was held up as a model of royal self-denial, the princess who had put her country before herself. Townsend himself faded from the public story, though never from her heart. He returned to Brussels and travelled, and in 1959 he married a young Belgian woman named Marie-Luce Jamagne. By an unsettling coincidence, she was some 16 years his junior, and those who met her said she bore a striking resemblance to the princess he had given up. Margaret learned of his engagement, it is said, only shortly before she accepted a proposal of her own. The two of them would meet again just once more, briefly and sadly, in the years that followed. Two people who had loved each other across an impossible gap and been kept apart, not by any failing of their own, but by the rules of an institution that valued its image above their happiness. But admiration is cold comfort at 25, when the man you love has just walked out of your life for good. And the sacrifice, however noble it looked from the outside, did something to Margaret that never healed. Something in her hardened, and at the same time something in her came loose. She had done the right thing, the dutiful thing, the thing the establishment demanded, and her reward was an empty apartment and a lifetime of being watched. If duty could take from her the one thing she wanted most in the world, then perhaps some part of her began to feel duty was owed nothing more in return. This is the founding wound of the whole story, and everything that follows flows from it. The reckless choices to come, the impulsive marriage, the affairs, the drinking, the deliberate flouting of the rules that had cost her Townsend, all of it grows from this single act of surrender in the autumn of 1955. She had been the golden girl who obeyed. She had given up love for the family, and the family had let her. And a woman who has sacrificed everything for an institution and found the institution unmoved is a woman who may spend the rest of her life quietly making it pay. It is worth sitting with the injustice of it, because the whole rest of her life turns on it. She had done nothing wrong. She had fallen in love with a good man, a war hero, a man her own father had trusted and loved. And for that entirely ordinary human thing, the wish to marry the person she loved, she had been ground down by the combined weight of the church, the crown, the cabinet, and the press until she surrendered. The lesson she took from it was not the noble one the newspapers praised. The lesson, buried deep and never spoken aloud, was that duty ran only one way. It took everything and gave nothing back. She had kept her side of the bargain, and the institution had shown her, in the plainest possible terms, that her happiness counted for nothing against its need to look pure. A person can carry a wound like that quietly for decades, but it does not heal. It waits. And when a wounded person finally stops obeying, when they decide the rules that cost them everything are owed no more respect, the reckoning can run for a lifetime and take down everyone within reach, including themselves. That was the true legacy of the autumn of 1955. Not the noble sacrifice the newspapers described, but a slow fuse, lit in a young woman's heart, that would burn for the next 4 decades. Those close to her said she was never the same again. The spark dimmed. The gaiety took on a brittle, defiant edge. She drank a little more, stayed out a little later, laughed a little harder and colder. The most photographed woman in Britain went on smiling for the cameras, but the smile had changed, and the private woman behind it was grieving a future that had been taken from her by the very people she had trusted to protect her. She was not yet 30. She had already lost the great love of her life, and into that grief, restless and wounded and desperate to feel something again, she would soon make the decision that sealed her fate. She would marry, not the man she loved, for he was gone, but a man who could match her glamour and, as it turned out, her capacity for cruelty. Chapter 7. A wedding built on a wound. 5 years after she gave up the man she loved, she married a man she barely knew, in front of 300 million people. His name was Anthony Armstrong Jones. He was a photographer, and not the sort of grand society portraitist the palace was used to. He was young, sharp, ambitious, and unconventional, a man who moved with ease through the worlds of art, fashion, and theatre, and who photographed dancers and actors and the bright young things of London with a modern, restless eye. He came from outside the aristocracy, the son of a barrister and a society beauty, and he had made his own name with his own talent. He was charming, clever, and just dangerous enough to be interesting. When Margaret met him at a supper party in the late 1950s, he was unlike any man in her stifling royal circle, and that was exactly the point. The romance was fast, and it was secret. After the very public agony of the Townsend affair, Margaret conducted this courtship almost entirely out of sight, meeting Armstrong Jones at his private studio hideaway by the river in the shabby, unfashionable end of London, a world away from the palace. There was a thrill in the concealment, a sense of a life she could keep for herself. And there was, beneath the thrill, the raw truth that she was a wounded woman looking for something to fill an unfillable space. In the autumn of 1959, only weeks after Peter Townsend had written to tell her he was to marry his young Belgian bride, Margaret accepted Armstrong Jones's proposal. Those who knew her wondered even then how much of the yes was love and how much was the wound. The wedding was a spectacle without precedent. It took place at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of May, 1960, and it became the first royal wedding ever broadcast live on television to the world. The numbers were staggering. An estimated 300 million people watched around the globe. Some 2,000 guests filled the Abbey. 20,000 people lined the streets outside. Margaret wore a gown of white silk organza, designed by Norman Hartnell, said to be one of the simplest and most elegant royal wedding dresses of the century. And on her head, she wore the Baltimore tiara, a great sunburst of diamonds that she had bought for herself at auction. Not a family heirloom handed down, but a crown she had chosen and paid for with her own money, as if to say that this, at least, was hers. Remember that tiara. It will matter at the very end. For a while, the marriage seemed to work, and it seemed to work brilliantly. Here were two beautiful, witty, creative rebels, and together they became the most glamorous couple in the country. Armstrong Jones was created Earl of Snowdon in 1961, so that any children would carry a title, and Margaret became the Countess of Snowdon. They set up home in a grand apartment inside Kensington Palace, apartment number 1A, a residence of some 20 rooms that was renovated and modernised at public expense before they moved in. They mixed with film stars and photographers and artists. They threw sharp, late, brilliant parties. For a brief season, the Golden Girl seemed to have found her golden ending after all, 5 years late and with a different man. The honeymoon set the tone for the dazzle. The couple sailed for 6 weeks through the Caribbean aboard the Royal Yacht Britannia, a floating palace crewed by hundreds. And it was on that voyage that Margaret first looked out from the deck on the little island of Mustique, where a friend had promised her a scrap of land. Back in London, they turned apartment 1A into one of the most fashionable addresses in the city. Snowdon designed and tinkered and rebuilt. Margaret filled the rooms with her paintings and her shells and her treasures. They gave sharp, late, brilliant parties where duchesses sat beside film stars and photographers. And for a few years, the Snowdons were the very picture of modern glamour. A royal couple with one foot in the palace and one in the bright bohemian world of the 1960s. Snowdon's own background is worth pausing on, because it explains something of what went wrong. He had grown up between a barrister father and a mother who became a countess by a later marriage, a childhood of divorce and boarding school, and a certain emotional chill. He had made himself entirely by his own talent, clawing his way up in the fierce world of London photography, and he had a driven, restless, sometimes ruthless streak. He was not a man content to walk 2 steps behind a princess and carry her gloves. He had his own name to make, his own pride to feed, and a marriage in which he was expected to be a decorative consort was never going to hold him for long. Then came the children, and with them, at first, real happiness. A son, David, was born in November of 1961, the boy who would one day inherit his father's title. A daughter, Sarah, followed in May of 1964. Margaret adored them both, and by the accounts of those who knew her, she was a warmer and more devoted mother than her rank required her to be. If the story had stopped there, it might have been a happy one. A wounded woman, a brilliant husband, 2 children, a palace apartment, and an island in the sun. But it did not stop there, because the marriage had been built on a wound, and the wound had never closed. Margaret had married partly to prove she could still be loved, and Armstrong Jones had married a princess partly for the dazzle of it, and 2 people who marry for those reasons are standing on sand. They were 2 alike in the wrong ways. Both were quick, proud, sharp-tongued, and easily bored. Both wanted to be the most interesting person in the room. Both had a talent for cruelty when they were hurt, and both, before very long, would go looking elsewhere for the thing they had failed to find in each other. The glamour held for the cameras. Behind the doors of apartment 1A, the competition had already begun, and the same 2 people the whole country envied as the most beautiful couple in Britain were about to spend the next decade tearing each other slowly and expertly to pieces. Chapter 8. The Marriage That Turned to Poison. The most glamorous couple in Britain spent the 1960s competing to see who could hurt the other more. The trouble began, as it so often does, with boredom and pride. By the middle of the 1960s, the first dazzle of the marriage had worn thin, and the 2 sharp, restless people underneath it had begun to grate. Snowdon was a man of enormous energy and ambition, and he threw himself into his photography and his projects with a focus that left Margaret alone in the palace for long stretches. Margaret, with no real work of her own, kept the hours of a woman with nothing to fill her days, rising late, drinking through the evenings, expecting her husband to dance attendance on a princess. He would not. He had a career, and a temper, and a growing contempt for the royal machine he had married into. What followed was not a quiet drifting apart. It was a war. Both of them took lovers, and neither took much trouble to hide it. Margaret was linked, over the years, to a Bordeaux wine producer named Anthony Barton, who was godfather to her own daughter, and to Robin Douglas Home, a nightclub pianist and a nephew of a former prime minister, a man who took his own life some months after their affair ended. Snowdon, for his part, pursued a string of women, among them Lady Jacqueline Rufus Isaacs and others from the fashionable world he moved through. The marriage became an arrangement of mutual betrayal, each affair a blow struck in a long, cold fight. Over the years, the newspapers attached a long list of famous names to Margaret, and the truth must be told carefully here. She was linked, in gossip and speculation, to figures as varied as the singer Mick Jagger, the actor Peter Sellers, and the film star David Niven, among others. Almost none of it was ever proven, and much of it was the ordinary froth that gathered around any glamorous woman of that era. The documented relationships were fewer and sadder than the legend: a wine producer, a doomed pianist, and later the young man on the island. But the rumours did their work all the same, because they fed a growing public picture of Margaret as a woman of appetite and indulgence, and that picture would cost her dearly when the mood of the country turned against her. The saddest of the real affairs was with Robin Douglas Home, the pianist. Their relationship was brief, and when it ended, Douglas Home fell into a deep depression, and some 18 months later, he took his own life. Margaret was not the cause of his death, and the roots of it ran far deeper than any single affair. But the episode cast a long shadow, and it hinted at something that ran through her whole romantic life, a way of drawing people close and then, held back by her rank and her caution and her fear, being unable to give them all of what they wanted. She was a woman built for love and denied the practice of it, and the people who loved her often paid a price. And the cruelty went beyond the affairs. Snowdon, by many accounts, developed a genius for wounding his wife in private. He is said to have left little notes for her to find around the apartment, lists of the things he hated about her, cutting messages tucked between the pages of a book or slipped into a drawer where only she would see them. He would humiliate her in front of guests with a sharp remark, then smile as though nothing had happened. Margaret gave as good as she got, pulling rank on him, freezing him out, using the full weight of her royal precedence as a weapon against the man who had once made her feel free. Two people who had married to escape their loneliness had built instead a machine for making each other miserable. The drinking grew heavier. Margaret had always enjoyed a cigarette and a whiskey, but now the habit hardened into something closer to a crutch. She smoked constantly, as many as 60 cigarettes in a day by some accounts, lighting one from the end of the last. She drank through the long, empty afternoons and the longer evenings. The famous wit turned sour and unpredictable, warm one moment and lacerating the next, and her friends learned to read the weather of her moods with care. The golden girl of the 1950s was becoming, by the end of the 1960s, a harder and unhappier woman, and the marriage that was meant to have saved her was doing the opposite. Caught in the middle of all this were two children. David and Sarah grew up inside a household where their parents conducted a slow, elegant, poisonous war, and where the affection between them had curdled into performance and spite. Margaret loved her children fiercely, and by their own later accounts, she gave them real warmth and real fun. But they also grew up watching a marriage die by inches, learning young that the beautiful public image and the ugly private truth were two entirely separate things, a lesson their mother had learned as a girl in a castle full of secrets. By the early 1970s, the marriage was over in all but name. Snowdon and Margaret led largely separate lives, sharing the apartment and the children and the public engagements, while keeping their real selves as far apart as possible. To the outside world, they were still the glamorous Snowdons. Behind the doors of apartment 1A, they barely spoke, except to wound. Margaret was in her early 40s now, twice denied the love she craved, once by the church and once by her own choice of husband, and she was lonelier than she had ever been in her heavily populated, endlessly watched life. She needed somewhere to escape, somewhere the cameras and the courtiers and the cruelty could not reach her. And by a stroke of fortune, she had exactly such a place waiting, thousands of miles away, on a tiny green island in the warm blue of the Caribbean. It was there, and only there, that Princess Margaret would find, in the unhappiest decade of her life, one last season of something like joy. Chapter 9. The Island Where She Felt Free. On a small Caribbean island, she owned a single acre of paradise, and there she found the last happiness of her life. The island was called Mustique. It sat in the Grenadines, a speck of scrub and beach in the eastern Caribbean, and in the late 1950s it had been bought, almost as a whim, by an eccentric and charming aristocrat named Colin Tennant, later Lord Glenconner, who was one of Margaret's oldest friends. He had paid a reported £45,000 for the whole island, a few hundred acres of undeveloped land with no roads, no harbour and no electricity, and he dreamed of turning it into a private paradise for the beautiful and the titled. As a wedding present, in 1960, Tennant gave Margaret a piece of it, a 10-acre plot on a headland at the southern tip of the island. For years the land sat empty, and then Margaret built on it. The house was called Les Jolies Eaux, the Pretty Waters, and it was designed by Oliver Messel, a celebrated theatrical set designer who happened to be the uncle of her husband. It rose slowly through the late 1960s and was finished in 1972, a single-story villa of pale stone in an elegant neo-Georgian style, married to the Caribbean light. It had 5 bedrooms and could sleep 10 guests. It had a wide drawing room, 2 guest lodges, a curving courtyard, decorative tiles and glass-panelled doors that opened straight onto the view. Its gardens were planted with lilies and oleander and bougainvillea, and its swimming pool was set so that its water seemed to meet the line of the sea at the horizon. Margaret loved it as she loved almost nothing else. In a life spent inside palaces and state apartments that belonged to the crown, that she occupied but never owned, this small villa on a far island was hers. She had chosen it, shaped it, filled it with her own taste. And she said of it, in a phrase that catches the whole tragedy of her position, that it was the only square inch in the world I own. Think about that. The Queen's sister, the most photographed woman in Britain, a princess surrounded all her life by the vast wealth of the monarchy, and the one place on earth that truly belonged to her was a single acre of headland, 4,000 miles from home. The only square inch in the world she owned. On Mustique, she could be, for a few weeks each year, something close to an ordinary woman. She went without stockings. She cooked. She swam and sunbathed and drank rum punch on the terrace and stayed up singing at the piano. The island was private, the guests were friends, and the long lenses of the London press were, for a while, far away. It was the one place where the performance stopped, where the golden girl could put down the weight of being golden and she guarded it fiercely. And it was there, into this rare pocket of freedom, that a young man walked in the autumn of 1973. His name was Roddy Llewellyn. He was a gentle, well-mannered garden designer, the son of an Olympic show jumper, and he was 17 years younger than Margaret. When Colin Tennant introduced them, she was 43 and he was 25. He was not a schemer or a fortune hunter. By every account, he was sweet-natured, amusing, a little lost himself, and genuinely kind to a lonely and unhappy woman who had almost forgotten what kindness from a man felt like. They had met, as it happened, not on the island, but far away in Scotland, at a lunch in the autumn of 1973, brought together by the ever-mischievous Colin Tennant. Llewellyn came from a good family. His father was Sir Harry Llewellyn, a famous Olympic show jumper who had won gold for Britain, and Roddy had drifted through his 20s without quite finding his feet, gentle and charming and a little aimless, working his slow way toward a life in gardens and landscape design. He was not looking for a princess, and she was not looking for a boy of 25. But something in each answered something in the other, the lonely older woman and the unanchored young man, and an unlikely tenderness grew between them almost at once. For Colin Tennant, the friendship was of a piece with the world he had built. He had spent a fortune turning Mustique from empty scrubland into a playground for the rich and the beautiful and the titled, importing everything, raising villas, drawing a glittering and faintly disreputable crowd of aristocrats and rock stars and runaways to his private kingdom in the sun. Into that permissive, sun-drunk world, Margaret fitted perfectly, and there, shielded by distance and by Tennant's fierce protection of his guests, she believed she could at last love where she pleased without the whole of Britain watching. For a few years, she was right. What grew between them was, in Margaret's own careful words, a loving friendship. He began to visit her on Mustique, a guest at Les Jolies Eaux, and in the sunshine of that private island, the unhappiest princess in Britain found, at last, a season of real joy. Her friends noticed the change in her. The brittleness softened. The old warmth came back. Years later, the Queen herself is said to have remarked that Roddy Llewellyn had made her sister truly happy, and from a family so sparing with such things, that was no small verdict. For the first time since Peter Townsend walked out of her life 18 years before, Margaret was happy in love. But she was not a private woman. She was never allowed to be. She was the sister of the Queen, a married royal, conducting an affair with a man half a generation younger on an island in the sun, and the world she had escaped was not going to leave her alone forever. The only square inch she owned was about to be invaded by a photographer with a long lens and a newspaper behind him, and the single image he carried away would turn her last happiness into the greatest scandal of her life. Chapter 10. One photograph ended everything. In February 1976, a single beach photograph turned a private happiness into a public scandal. The picture was taken on Mustique in February of 1976. It showed Princess Margaret and Roddy Llewellyn together in swimsuits at the edge of the sea. There was nothing lurid in it. It was, by the standards of a later age, almost innocent, a middle-aged woman and a younger man on a beach. But the meaning of it was unmistakable, and a British Sunday newspaper splashed it across its pages. And in an instant, the private world Margaret had guarded so fiercely was torn wide open. The effect was atomic. Here was proof, in a single photograph, of everything the rumours had whispered. The Queen's sister, a married mother of two, 45 years old, was on a tropical island with a lover 17 years her junior. The newspapers had a name for him ready-made. They called him her toy boy, and the phrase stuck like tar. For weeks, the story ran and ran. The beach, the age gap, the island, the wine, the whole delicious scandal of a princess behaving as no princess was supposed to behave. Roddy Llewellyn, hunted by reporters, issued a public statement of apology, professing his respect and loyalty to the Queen and the royal family, but the damage was done and could not be undone. The world had changed since 1955, and that was the heart of the disaster. In the deferential Britain of the Townsend years, the press had held back, at least at first, and the establishment had been able to steer the story. By 1976, that world was gone. The tabloids were hungrier, harder, and richer. The long lens had made privacy almost impossible, and the appetite for royal scandal had grown enormous. There was no discreet posting to Brussels that could fix this, no quiet word from a private secretary that could make it disappear. The photograph existed. It was on every front page, and it could not be unseen. For the first time, the machinery that had controlled Margaret's whole life simply could not control the story, and she and the monarchy were both left exposed to a press that no longer feared them. For Margaret herself, the humiliation was total. She was 45 years old. She was a mother of two, the sister of the Queen, and she had been caught, in the eyes of the world, as a middle-aged woman chasing a much younger man. The very happiness that had lifted her out of the misery of her marriage was now the thing being used to destroy her. Everything private had been made public. Everything tender had been made tawdry. The one relationship in 20 years that had made her feel loved and alive was reduced, in the headlines, to a dirty joke about a princess and her toy boy. For the palace, it was a catastrophe of image. The monarchy sold itself on dignity, on the idea that the royal family stood above the mess of ordinary human appetite. And here was the Queen's own sister, splashed across the tabloids in a swimsuit beside her young lover, making the whole institution look foolish. The men in grey suits, the courtiers whose entire purpose was the protection of the crown's reputation, faced exactly the crisis they had spent Margaret's whole life trying to prevent. The difference was that now, in the harder, hungrier press culture of the 1970s, they could not contain it. There was no Brussels to send anyone to. The photograph was already everywhere. The marriage, long dead in private, could not survive the exposure. Within weeks of the picture appearing, on the 19th of March 1976, Buckingham Palace issued a formal announcement. The Princess and the Earl of Snowdon had agreed to live apart. Their marriage, the statement said, had irretrievably broken down. It was couched in the flat, careful language of official communication, but everyone understood what it meant. The most glamorous marriage in Britain was over, and it had ended in the full glare of a scandal, with a beach photograph as its epitaph. There was a bleak irony in how the collapse was received, even inside the family. Snowdon, who had conducted his own affairs for years, emerged from the wreck with his reputation largely intact, cast by many as the wronged husband of a wayward wife. Margaret, who had endured his cruelty for the better part of a decade before finding her own happiness at last, was cast as the guilty party. The double standard was stark, and she felt it keenly, but there was nothing to be done. The photograph had written the story, and in that story she was the villain. Here, the cruelty of Margaret's whole life sharpens to a point. Consider the symmetry of it. In 1955, the establishment had destroyed her chance of happiness with Peter Townsend in order to protect the monarchy's image, forcing her to give up the man she loved for the good of the crown. 2 decades later, that same monarchy could no longer protect its image at all, and her private happiness with Roddy Llewellyn was dragged into the open and made a public disgrace. Once the machine had crushed her love to keep up appearances, Now it could not keep up appearances no matter what it did. Margaret had been punished in the first act for obeying, and punished again in the third for finally reaching for joy. The public turned. The woman who had been admired in 1955 for her noble sacrifice was now, in 1976, condemned as a selfish, aging royal, carrying on with a young man at the taxpayer's expense. The sympathy curdled into scorn. The newspapers that had once praised her duty now catalogued her indulgence, her holidays, her drinking, her island, her lover. She had spent her whole life being watched, and now the watching had turned cruel, and there was nowhere to hide from it, not even on the only square inch in the world she owned. And still the worst of the public humiliation was to come, because the separation was only the beginning. Ahead lay the divorce itself, and with it a storm of anger that would reach all the way into the House of Commons, where her own government would debate whether the nation should be paying for her at all. The beach photograph had ended her marriage. Now it would put a price on her head. Chapter 11. Parliament called her a parasite. When the divorce came, the attacks were not whispered at court. They were shouted across the floor of the House of Commons. The divorce was finalised in the summer of 1978. The decree came through in the middle of that year, and it made history in a way Margaret would have given anything to avoid. It was the first divorce of a senior member of the British royal family since 1901, the first in the modern age of the monarchy. A taboo that had held for the better part of a century, the very taboo that had cost Margaret her chance with Peter Townsend, was broken, and it was broken by Margaret herself. Snowdon, for his part, moved on quickly, marrying again before the year was out. Margaret, who by several accounts had never truly wanted the divorce, would never remarry. The legal steps were swift and public. The decree that began the divorce came in the May of 1978, and it was made final that July. And with it, Margaret became the first senior member of the royal family to be divorced in the modern era. Snowdon remarried within months, taking as his second wife a young woman named Lucy Lindsay Hogg, and by most accounts, he and Margaret managed, in time, a wary peace for the sake of their 2 children. But the ending of the marriage settled nothing about the deeper problem, which was money, and the country's swelling resentment of what it paid to keep a princess in the manner to which she was accustomed. But it was not the legal fact of the divorce that wounded her most. It was the public fury over its cost. By the late 1970s, Britain was a harder, angrier, more sceptical country than the deferential nation of her youth. The economy was in trouble. Ordinary people were struggling. And the sight of a divorced princess, holidaying on a private Caribbean island with a young lover while drawing a handsome income from the public purse, was more than many were willing to stomach. The question moved out of the gossip columns and onto the floor of Parliament itself. The numbers made the anger sharp. Margaret drew a civil list annuity from the taxpayer, an income that would rise over the following years until, by the time of her death, it was reported to stand at around £219,000 a year. She was one of 8 members of the wider royal family drawing such parliamentary annuities, a group whose payments together came to about £1.5 million a year. She kept a household of staff. She occupied a 20-room apartment in Kensington Palace that had been done up at public expense, and she took long, sun-soaked holidays on Mustique, 4,000 miles away, while the country that paid for her tightened its belt. To her critics, the arithmetic was obscene. In the House of Commons, the attacks were open and personal. Labour members of Parliament, some of them long-standing opponents of the monarchy, rose to denounce her in language that would once have been unthinkable. She was called a royal parasite. She was called, to her lasting humiliation, a flusy. There were calls for her to be removed from the civil list altogether, to be cut off from public money, to be made to pay her own way like anyone else. The sister of the Queen, the golden girl of the 1950s, sat in her palace apartment and read her name spoken with contempt in the highest chamber of the land. The fiercest of her critics was a Labour member named William Hamilton, a Scottish Republican who had built a career on attacking the cost of the monarchy and who dismissed Margaret in one much-quoted phrase as an expensive kept woman. He was not alone. The middle 1970s were years of strikes and shortages and hard living, and to many ordinary people struggling to pay their bills, the sight of a divorced princess flying off to a private Caribbean island with a young lover, all of it underwritten by the taxpayer, was simply more than they could stomach. The monarchy had always depended on the public believing that the family earned its keep. Margaret, in those years, became the living argument for the other side, the royal who seemed to take much and give little, and no amount of charity work or official duty could quite scrub the image away. It is worth pausing on how far she had fallen. Turn back the clock just over 20 years to the autumn of 1955. Then, Margaret had been the nation's darling, praised in every newspaper for her selfless devotion to duty, held up as a model of royal sacrifice for giving up Peter Townsend. She had done everything the establishment asked. She had put the crown before her own heart, and her reward, 2 decades on, was to be jeered at as a parasite and a flusy by her own parliament, her private misery turned into a public grievance. Her whole way of life held up as evidence of a monarchy that cost too much and gave too little. Something in her never recovered from it. She had lost Townsend to duty. She had lost Snowdon to mutual cruelty. She had lost Roddy Llewellyn, too, in time, for he drifted gently out of her romantic life and married a younger woman at the start of the 1980s, though they stayed close as friends. And now, she had lost the last thing she had left, the affection of the public, the warm regard that had carried her through every earlier trouble. The golden girl was 47 years old, divorced, mocked, lonely, and increasingly unwell, and the applause that had followed her since the war had finally turned to scorn. She had spent 2 decades quietly defying the institution that broke her heart, refusing to disappear, refusing to be tidied away, living exactly as she pleased in open contempt of the rules. In that, she had won a strange and bitter victory. But every victory of that kind carried a cost, and the bills were now coming due all at once in her body and her spirit. Having survived everything the church, the crown, and the parliament could do to her, Princess Margaret would spend her final years being destroyed by the only enemy left, herself. Chapter 12. The Slow Ruin of a Princess. She had beaten the establishment by refusing to disappear, and now she began, quietly, to destroy herself instead. The instruments of her ruin were the ones she had carried all her life, the cigarette and the glass. Margaret had smoked since she was a young woman, and by her middle years the habit had become a dependency that ruled her days. She got through as many as 60 cigarettes a day at her worst, often in the long, elegant holder that had once looked so glamorous and now looked like what it was, the sign of an addiction. She drank steadily too, whiskey above all, through the empty afternoons and the long, lonely evenings in apartment 1A. What had once been the fast living of a bright young princess had hardened, decade by decade, into something closer to a slow act of self-harm. Underneath it lay a depression that never fully lifted. In the 1970s, around the collapse of her marriage, she suffered what those close to her described as a breakdown, and was treated for the darkness that had shadowed her since the loss of Peter Townsend. She had a first-class mind and no real use for it, a warm heart and no safe place to give it, and the years of being watched and judged and finally mocked had worn her down. She filled the emptiness with company and cigarettes and drink, and the company went home, and the cigarettes and the drink stayed. She was treated, at one low point in those years, for the depression that had shadowed her, and she leaned hard on a small circle of loyal friends to get through the worst of it. But the help had its limits, because the thing that ailed her was not only in the body, it was the accumulated weight of a whole life spent being told no. No to Townsend, no to a role of her own, no to privacy, to ordinary happiness, to the simple freedom to live unwatched. She had wealth and rank and a famous name, and almost none of the things that actually make a person well, and no doctor could write a prescription for those. The body began to send its warnings. In the early 1980s, she was treated for a benign growth, a first sign of trouble. Then, on a January day in 1985, at the age of 54, she underwent an operation to remove part of her left lung. The official word was that the growth removed was not cancerous, but the meaning of the surgery was impossible to miss, and it must have chilled her to the bone. Because her own father, King George VI, the shy man the abdication had made a king, had been a heavy smoker too, and he had died of illness, bound up with his lungs at only 56, worn out before his time. Margaret was now walking the same road her father had walked, cigarette in hand, toward the same end. Here the scale of the damage becomes plain. She had smoked for the better part of 40 years. She had lived through the loss of one great love in 1955, a poisonous marriage across the 1960s, a public divorce in 1978, and the scorn of Parliament in the years after. She was funded by an income that would climb toward £219,000 a year, yet she was, by the middle 1980s, a woman in visibly failing health, twice wounded in love and once in marriage, drinking and smoking in a palace apartment with her children, grown and her best years long behind her. The arithmetic of her decline was written in cigarettes and lost years. She gave up smoking at last around 1991, but the harm was already deep in her. In January of 1993, she was taken to hospital with pneumonia. The famous energy was fading. The wit was still there, sharp as ever when she chose to use it, but it flashed now out of a frailer and more tired woman. The friends of her youth were aging or dying. The bright circle of the Margaret set had scattered into memory, and the woman who had once been the most photographed in Britain increasingly kept to her own rooms, her own routines, her own dwindling world. There is a terrible logic to it, and the film should not look away from it. Margaret had spent her life being defined by others, by the family that dragged her into its heart and then denied her the man she loved, by the church that would not bend, by the Parliament that grudged her every pound, by the press that built her up and tore her down. The one thing that was left entirely to her, the one square inch of choice no institution could take away, was what she did to her own body, and she chose, year after year, to punish it. Whether that was carelessness or grief, or the long, slow revenge of a woman who had been given everything except a reason to take care of herself, is the question the film leaves open. The result was the same. The golden girl was ruining herself, and there was no one who could stop her. And the ruin, once it truly took hold, would move fast, and it would strip from her one by one the last things she had: her strength, her beauty, and finally her life. Chapter 13. The Golden Girl Fades to Grey. The most beautiful woman in Britain ended her days in a wheelchair, in dark glasses, scarcely recognizable to the nation that had adored her. The strokes began in 1998. In February of that year, at her beloved villa on Mustique, the very place that had given her her last happiness, Margaret suffered a mild stroke. It was a warning, and it was not heeded gently by fate. The island that had been her refuge now became the scene of a second, crueler blow. Early in 1999, again on Mustique, she stepped into a bath and scalded her feet terribly in water that was far too hot. The injury was severe. It damaged her mobility badly, left her in lasting pain, and increasingly confined her to a wheelchair. The only square inch in the world she owned had turned, at the end, into the place where her body began to fail her. The last 4 years of her life read like a medical chronicle of decline. A mild stroke on Mustique in 1998. The scalding of both feet in 1999, so severe that she could barely walk afterward. A spell in hospital in the January of 2001, unable to eat. By the March of that year, partial blindness and paralysis down her left side. 2 final public appearances in the second half of 2001, each frailer than the last. And then, on the 9th of February 2002, the end itself. 6 distinct blows in 4 short years, each one stripping away a little more of the woman who had once been the brightest in Britain. From there, the decline was steep and unforgiving. Further strokes followed. In January of 2001, she was taken to hospital, unable to eat properly, struggling to swallow. By the spring of that year, the accumulated damage had robbed her of much of her sight and left her partly paralyzed down one side. The transformation was heartbreaking to those who remembered her. Consider the span of it. In 1950, she had been the most glamorous woman in the world, 5 feet of couture and diamonds and dazzling blue eyes, the face that sold newspapers across 4 continents. By 2001, she was a frail figure in a wheelchair, hidden behind large, dark glasses. One side of her body stilled, her famous beauty gone. She made her last public appearances that year, and they were painful to witness. She appeared, diminished and unwell, at the 101st birthday celebrations of her mother, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, in August of 2001. She appeared again, more frail still, at the 100th birthday of her aunt, Princess Alice, that December. In the photographs from those last outings, she is barely recognizable as the golden girl of half a century before, a swollen, shadowed, sightless figure, where once there had been the brightest woman in Britain. The nation that had adored her, and then mocked her, now mostly pitied her, and looked away. The end came in the winter. On the morning of the 9th of February, 2002, Princess Margaret died in her sleep at King Edward VII's Hospital in London, after a final stroke and the heart trouble that came with it. She was 71 years old. There was a bitter poignancy even in the date, for she died just 3 days after the 50th anniversary of the death of her father, the king whose accession had trapped her and whose fatal habits she had shared to the end. In one last quiet act of choice, she had asked to be cremated rather than buried in the usual royal manner. She wished her ashes to rest beside her father in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor, and so they were interred there that spring. And in a final cruel symmetry, the mother she left behind did not long survive her. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, the beloved matriarch who had outshone and outlived her difficult younger daughter, died just 7 weeks later, on the 30th of March 2002, at the age of 101. The golden girl who had been given everything died first, worn out at 71. The mother went to a nation's mourning at 101. Even in death, Margaret was the one who left too soon, and the one the crowds did not queue for. For a woman who had been watched every day of her life, the quietness of her going was almost merciful. There were no long lenses now. There was no scandal, no parliament, no crowd. only a frail woman slipping away in a hospital bed, 3 days after the anniversary of her father's death, having outrun every institution that ever tried to manage her and arrived, at last, somewhere none of them could follow. But the story of Princess Margaret was not quite over, because a life like hers leaves things behind, and 4 years after her death, everything she had owned would be laid out under the lights of a sale room, and the world would see, in pounds and pence, exactly what the woman who had it all had managed to keep. Chapter 14. What the Envied Woman Left Behind. 4 years after her death, everything she had owned was carried into a sale room and sold to the highest bidder. In June of 2006, the great auction house of Christie's in London held a 2-day sale of the personal collection of the late Princess Margaret. Her children, David and Sarah, had decided to sell, in large part to meet the heavy inheritance tax that fell on her estate. And so the private world of the Queen's sister, the jewels and the trinkets and the treasures of a lifetime, was spread out for public sale. More than 800 lots went under the hammer. Every single one of them sold. The numbers tell their own story, and they are worth hearing in full. The sale raised a total of £13,658,728, far beyond what anyone had expected. Queen Mary's Diamond Riviere, a great necklace of stones, fetched £993,600, and the Baltimore tiara, the sunburst of diamonds that Margaret had bought for herself at auction all those years before, and worn on her head at Westminster Abbey on her wedding day in 1960, sold for £926,400 to a private buyer, and it has never been publicly seen since. The crown she had chosen and paid for, the one thing at that wedding that was truly hers, vanished into a stranger's vault and was gone. Remember the tiara from the beginning of this story. Remember that she bought it herself, a crown of her own choosing in a life where almost nothing was hers to choose. It sat on her head on the one day she seemed to have found her golden ending, and in the end it was sold to pay a tax bill and disappeared from the world entirely, as though it had followed its owner into the dark. There could be no truer symbol of the whole arc of her life. Everything she had, she lost. Everything she chose was taken. Even the crown she paid for with her own money ended up scattered to the highest bidder. The villa went the same way. Les Jolies Hauts, the only square inch in the world she owned, the one place on earth that had truly belonged to her, did not stay in the family either. In 1996, 6 years before her death, she had given it to her son, David, partly to soften the death duties that were coming. And in 1999 he sold it for a reported £2.4 million to an American buyer, a sale that is said to have wounded Margaret deeply in her last years. The pretty waters passed out of her hands. Today, the house is let to wealthy holidaymakers by the week, at rates running to tens of thousands of pounds. The private sanctuary of a princess became a luxury rental, open to anyone who could pay. So what did the woman who had it all actually leave behind? Not the jewels, which were sold. Not the villa, which was sold. Not the throne, which was never hers. Not the man she loved, whom she gave up. Nor the husband she married, who turned against her. Nor even, in the end, the affection of the public that had once adored her. She left behind 2 children who loved her. She left a reputation that has only grown more fascinating with time, endlessly retold in books and films, the brilliant, wounded, self-destructive sister who has become the very archetype of the royal spare. And she left a question that will not go away, because her life poses it as sharply as any life in the modern monarchy. She was handed almost everything a person can be given: royal birth, beauty, wealth, fame, freedom, and she was denied the single thing she wanted, the right to love on her own terms, first by the church and the crown in 1955, and then, when she finally reached for happiness again, by the long lens and the scandal it made. The world envied her every day of her life, and for most of that life she was profoundly unhappy. That is the emptiness at the heart of having everything, and Margaret lived it more completely than almost anyone who ever wore a tiara. Most people remember Princess Margaret as the golden girl of the British monarchy, the most photographed woman in the country, with the whole world at her feet. That is how the story began, and it is true as far as it goes. But the fuller truth is the harder one. She had the palaces and the jewels and the fame and the freedom, and she held on to almost none of it, and the only square inch in the world she truly owned was a scrap of headland 4,000 miles from home that her family sold within 3 years of her death. She was the woman who had it all. And piece by piece, love by love, year by year, she threw it all away, or had it taken, until there was nothing left to sell but the crown she had bought for herself, and even that vanished into the dark. If this story stayed with you to the end, subscribe, because there are many more like it on the way, told the way you have just heard this one. And tell me below what you truly think. Do you believe Princess Margaret threw it all away? Or do you believe the family took the one thing that might have saved her and left her to ruin the rest? I read every reply,